Welcome to this discussion on Belarus. I am Edward Lucas, non-resident fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and I'm joined by Mathieu Boulègue, who is from Chatham House in London, but is also the author of a new CEPA report on Russia's assets and liabilities in Belarus. And our other guest is CEPA's Katia Glod, a non-resident fellow of our Russia programme, herself Belarusian, and author of many reports and commentaries on Belarus, which you can find on our website. And we've got a lot to talk about because Belarus has seized the public attention since the fake election in August, which Alyaksandr Lukashenko claimed he'd won. And we've seen demonstrations now 100 days of people braving the riot police, braving water cannon and tear gas and beatings, coming out onto the street, demanding dignity, democracy, decency in public life. But there are so many unanswered questions. One of them is, what do the Belarusians really want? What sort of country do they want Belarus to be? Is it to be part of the West, part of the EU? Do they have a clear geopolitical orientation? What sort of economic system do they want? What sort of relations do they want to have with their big neighbor Russia, a country with which, in theory, they are part of a single union state? Then there's the question about what Russia wants to do. What will they do to keep Lukashenko in power? Do they want Lukashenko to be in power? Who would they rather have in power instead of Lukashenko? What do they actually want in Belarus? What's the Russian agenda? And then there's the question of the West, which has been inattentive towards Belarus, to put it mildly, for a period of nearly 3 decades, and seems to have been caught rather at a loss by the demonstrations. Plenty of photo ops for Mrs. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the Belarusian opposition in exile, but an absence of policy, except, of course, in Lithuania. An honourable exception to that, neglect, and subject we'll be getting on to shortly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to my panel and start the discussion. I'm sure everyone watching this knows the tragic news that we've had in recent days of the death of Roman Bondarenko, not the first demonstrator to be killed, beaten to death by the police, dying shortly after his arrest. One of, I think, 6 casualties, and he and the other victims of the repression in Belarus are in all our thoughts. But I'm going to get straight onto the policy analysis side of this. And I'm going first of all to go to Katia. Katia, bring us up to date with what's happening and what your analysis has been for CEPA.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Edward, for the introduction. Well, I have looked at Belarus in my particular paper since the summer mobilization that we have seen in this country. We have seen unprecedented development of civil society. It has been developing in leaps and bounds. We have seen incredible solidarity and the development of horizontal ties, the development of infrastructure, of the protest movement. And obviously, as I've just said, we have seen very big protest movement in Belarus. The protest movement encompasses various strata of society. It's young people, it's not very young people, it's elderly, pensioners, it's students, it's workers, it's the middle class, and the protest has really reached every corner of Belarus. We have seen protests in Minsk. More recently, in the last few months, rallies have taken place on Sundays in Minsk, but they have also been in other places all over the country. In other words, as I've just said, people are protesting. People are protesting against the illegitimate authority of Alyaksandr Lukashenko. People want freedom. People want their voice to be heard. And obviously, we have seen a very harsh response from the side of the authorities. I wrote my paper.
Yeah, but I just wanted to just back up a moment, because what we haven't seen has been a successful general strike, and that looked as though it was a bit of a miscalculation by the opposition. They called a general strike at the end of October, And although there was, some workers went out on strike, it seems to me the one thing they haven't done, or the two things they haven't done, one is to really get into the industrial working class, into these big enterprises that are the kind of backbone of the regime. And the other thing they haven't done so far is to get any significant defections from the ranks of the regime. And those seem to me to be two strategic problems for the opposition.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Edward. In fact, I think even the largest problem of the Belarusian opposition is that they're very new to this. They have not yet come up with a strategy, although yesterday on the 16th of November, we have seen 100 days of the protest. The opposition are still thinking in terms of putting pressure on the regime from the side of the international community. They're thinking about helping the victims of the repression, but they're not really thinking about how they're going to reach power, how they're going to indeed achieve these defections. And that's the main problem. As far as the defections are concerned, it's not so easy because obviously Belarus has seen a very personalist regime of Alyaksandr Lukashenko that has hollowed out the institutions. We can't really compare Belarus to either Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, where color revolutions took place, because there was some representation of the opposition in some state bodies, and we don't have that at all in Belarus. There is massive state control, and all the state structures, be it parliament or the security services or the government, they're all really controlled by one person, right, and his cronies.
So, sorry, go on.
As far as the industrial strike is concerned, I think we have seen quite a few workers protesting. And we have, at the very beginning, when the election happened and there was this immediate post-election violence, we saw many workers marching in Minsk, in other cities. We saw also, in fact, Lukashenko come into one of the main factories in Belarus and people shouting at him, "Leave, go away." So the workers have been quite engaged in this protest. But there is obviously a lot of control by the state over these workers. Well, the first thing to be aware of is that there are no free trade unions in Belarus. There are official state-controlled trade unions, and therefore it's not so easy to organize a strike, obviously.
Of course, it isn't easy at all. If it was easy, I guess the opposition would already be winning. But let me turn to you, Mathieu, because it seems to me we have a kind of war of attrition going on in Belarus, where the opposition is refusing to give up, but it's also not winning. And that makes it particularly important to look at how outside countries are getting involved or not getting involved. And perhaps the most important thing is, what does the Kremlin make of all this? Can you shed any light on what the thinking and behavior is from the Russian Federation towards the country, which is perhaps its closest ally?
Absolutely, thank you very much, Edward, and it's great to be here today. I think what this crisis in Belarus has revealed is also the different level of influence, and mostly negative influence, that Russia has been enjoying over the country, in a way, enjoying for them, but not really enjoyable for Belarus and its citizens, of course, in terms of the assets and the sort of pressure points that the Kremlin can amplify and use as a set of tools to influence policy in Minsk in one way or another. And I think this crisis has been the opportunity for the Kremlin to sort of hunker down on the set of tools and the set of different assets that they can exploit to try to make sure that, if this crisis is, of course, not presented as geopolitical, as it is, because it is very much about Belarusians taking their destiny, in a way, in their hands, but Russia has been certainly using different pressure points in the political sphere, in societal influence and information manipulation, for instance, in the economic or security sphere, to try to once again hunker down or bank on its assets and increase or reconfigure its networks in terms of negative influence. As they would say, it's more positive for them because they feed on instability and they feed on the chaos at their border. And this crisis has been very instrumental in making sure that Russia is still a top dog in whatever comes out of this crisis, future polls, or whatever comes out of Belarus. in the coming
Yes,
months.
it's interesting because the Kremlin clearly doesn't want Lukashenko to be toppled. They don't want a sort of disorderly change in the regime, but they are not in a position to decide right now what happens next. So they're kind of fending off the opposition, offering soft support, one might call it, to the regime. But clearly they're working behind the scenes toward something. And as I don't think that Lukashenko will ever be acceptable from the point of view of the Belarusian opposition, presumably they've got some plan, or they're working towards some plan to replace him, perhaps in the early part of next year.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I would argue that Russia is seeking a form of managed transition in Minsk, because they know that Lukashenko's time is almost up and he's sort of using the his final time now. So they're trying to make the most of this sort of post transition period to reconfigure their network around whatever comes next. I was saying that Russia's feeding on chaos, but they also very much like stability. Moscow is pro-stability in a way, and it doesn't mean they are pro-Lukashenko, but they still believe in the Kremlin at the moment that Lukashenko is the maybe least worst case scenario at the moment before Russia can actually extort enough influence or reconfigure its network enough that they can actually dump Lukashenko, which will probably happen when they decide to do it, or when there is enough pressure from the streets or from the international community altogether to basically leave him by the wayside. So I completely agree. At the moment, if you take Russia's strategic outlook in perspective, then keeping Lukashenko in place and sort of backing him softly is the best way to advance Russian interests. It doesn't mean that they are not trying to have a sort of formal conciliation with the opposition. They cannot be seen overtly as backing the opposition, of course, not least because it is a movement that is coming from the streets. And if there's something that President Putin hates even more than anything, it is color revolutions, and is something they very much fear at home. So they cannot overtly be seen, of course, as backing something so grassroots, so bottom up as a form of color revolution that could be replicated in a way in Russia as they would fear. So they need to carefully balance that.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox, really. The Kremlin risks, by trying to keep Lukashenko in power, they risk making the protests geopolitical. And at the moment, unlike in Ukraine or in Georgia, or to an extent also in Moldova, we don't see people waving EU flags, let alone NATO flags. It's all very focused on the democracy agenda. But if people start equating the Lukashenko regime with the Kremlin that fundamentally is keeping him there, that might happen. But I want to turn to you, Katia, to give us a sense of how do the Belarusians feel about the outside world as to the West vis-a-vis the outside world to the East. Are they blaming the West for not supporting them? Are they blaming the Kremlin for supporting Lukashenko, or do they really just want to get on with it on their own and would like all outside parties to stay out?
That's a very good question, Edward. And I think we have seen some dynamic in this process. At the very beginning in August, when it seemed that the revolution will not take a long time and the luck will be soon on the side of the protesters, I think both the opposition and the public were very careful not to be seen as pro-EU or pro-Russian, and they tried to say that this is just about the future of Belarus, that the protest is not geopolitical. To some extent, that's still the case, but I think the more Russia has been playing the negative role that we have seen, what Matthew has just mentioned, the sending Russian informants to Belarus, backing up Lukashenko economically and politically, the more disillusioned Belarusians have become with the Kremlin, and the more the opposition has been engaged with the West, because it has seen that it's not really receiving any help or support from Russia. And it cannot do much to change the situation inside Belarus. So therefore, their tactic was more to rely on the Western pressure. As far as the public is concerned in Belarus, I think they obviously are very happy with any solidarity that Europe is showing to them, that the United States is showing to Belarus. And I think that with the increase in repression that we have seen recently, people are becoming more desperate, and they actually want more sanctions from Europe, more sanctions from the US. They want no economic sanctions. They want to target the state-owned companies, state banks. They want to target particularly those companies that belong to Lukashenko's oligarchs, who feed on his regime. Because people feel that they can't really change the situation inside. And they're obviously becoming more pro-Western in their feelings, even though there are no polls in Belarus at the moment. We don't know the latest statistics, but even the statistics that was available a year ago, we already saw that the gap between those preferring the EU and those who would like to stay in the current union state with Russia is closing. And I think probably by now the balance has already tipped, and more people have become more pro-European and pro-Western in general than we saw last year.
And there's the odd thing is that we see Svetlana Tikhanovskaya going round Western capitals. I think as we speak, she's just been in Stockholm talking to the Swedish government, and there's clearly, everybody seems to want a photo op with her. But there doesn't seem to be very much happening. And I almost wonder if the European countries, with the notable exception of Lithuania that we may get onto later, don't really know what to do about Belarus. This is sort of, it's not a country which has occupied a lot of attention in Western capitals in previous years, unfortunately, and now they seem a bit baffled. So, Mathieu, do you think is there anything towards Belarus in the West that one could call a Western strategy, or even an approach?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? And we don't really have at European level, and not least at global West level, if we count the United States, a sort of common vision of what to do with the eastern flank, what to do with the former Soviet Union region, which is decreasingly former Soviet and has a destiny of its own throughout the region, which in a way requires more unity of understanding and unity of the Russia challenge as well, which we don't have in the European Union, not least. So I completely agree. There's a lot of photo op going on with Tikhanovskaya, for instance, but there is little understanding of what the next steps are, because we have that many understanding of what the next steps are. If you look at Paris, if you look at Berlin, or even in the UK, there is no clear or common understanding of what should we do with Belarus. This has a lot to do with this sort of Eastern fatigue beyond the Ukraine fatigue in a way. This sort of Eastern fatigue that this whole region, if you trace it to Moldova, to Belarus, to Ukraine, is a region of its own now increasingly, but has no pathway to a clear future. Ukraine is in a very complicated situation. Moldova is revamping itself, but God knows if this new sort of evolution of the political system will give way to anything positive. And I'd like to salute the election win for Maya Sandu, which is, in a way, if you compare Tikhanovskaya, she could be a sort of Maya Sandu where she was a few years ago. And this is also feeding hope for the European and international community that this could be the next best thing, right? This could take months, this could take years, but in a way, if you start the fight now, this could lead to better things. But we still have to get, in a way, to grasp a bit better what it is that Belarus wants from the West as well. I think this is very much the problem and the expectations from Tikhanovskaya, that we can't do their own homework, and it is up to the opposition, and if it is coalescing around Tikhanovskaya or any other potential future leader of Belarus, that what it is they want from the West, what it is they want from the EU, and what is the future policy pathway, without, of course, obviously and overtly geopoliticizing it as it is, because this would bring Russia in the fold, and this is something that is very complicated to deal with. And also because dialogue is on the table with Russia. If you look at Macron's initiative, for instance, or his very, very timid attempts at trying to bring back Russia, or bring Russia back in from the cold, as it were. So there is also this balancing to be had at the moment that is limiting the impact of European policy towards Belarus, I would say.
I think it's certainly true that the European Union's Eastern Partnership, which was aiming to have a policy for Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, and the three countries of the Caucasus. Perhaps the one thing that united all those countries, that they didn't think it was fair that they were in the Eastern Partnership. It was a sort of extraordinary one size fits nobody approach. And I think that your criticisms of the EU on that are very well taken. But you've raised, I think, what is actually perhaps the number one question, which is, what do Belarusians really want? And this feeling that we've had since, and really since the Soviet era, of slight puzzlement about what is the Belarusian national identity. Is this a kind of country that's lumbering towards the national rebirth, which other countries had in the 19th century, of codifying the language and finding literary and historical roots going back before Russian colonization, and this very familiar process which we see everywhere, from the Czech Republic through to Estonia and elsewhere? Or is that the wrong framework? Is that not the right way of looking at it? So Katia, give us, as somebody who actually has, you are yourself from Belarus, what is the sense of place? Where does Belarus want to be, or is it the national identity mainly just defined in terms of what it doesn't want to be?
Well, I think this is now a very pertinent question, and this is what Belarusians are debating, discussing, and even feeling or realizing through their protests, through their action. They are talking about that, indeed, as you rightly, Edward, has said, that Belarusians are just getting in the last carriage of a train, trying to understand who they are and how they want to live together, what unites them. Indeed, when Belarus was an independent state for a very short period in 1918, and then obviously in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed and independent Belarus was declared, for several years, Belarus had Stanislav Shishkevich as the head of state, who was a liberal, a reformist, a reform-minded governor. But very soon Lukashenko came to power, and he halted the reforms, and he proposed the so-called social contract, which is quite familiar to all authoritarian regimes, when the basic needs, or even medium level needs of people are met, but people stay away from politics. And that's how Belarus has lived for nearly 26 years of Lukashenko's rule. And it became really only apparent this summer that people don't want that anymore, that Lukashenko for them equals with stagnation, that he cannot propose an exciting, prosperous future for the country. What Belarusians are indeed clear, as you, Edward, rightly put it, about, they're clear what they don't want. They don't want Lukashenko, they don't want his stagnation, they don't want his authoritarianism or even totalitarianism, as we're seeing some signs of. And they clearly want more freedom. They want freedom of expression, they want freedom to assembly, they want their basic human rights to be respected, they want the governments to choose themselves their governments, and they want this government to be accountable to them. And that really is explained, I think, by the coming of age of one or two generations of Belarusians. At the fore of this protest, we see people in their 40s. This is the first generation that grew up under the perestroika time and became teenagers when Shushkevich was in power. And these people, they already don't remember the Soviet Union. For them, independence comes for granted, but they also want more freedom. They want more opportunity for themselves. And obviously we have younger people who are very much included into the globalization, information globalization, cultural globalization. And for them, Lukashenko is like a freak from the 19th century. They at all don't associate themselves with him. And now it's really the high time for people to think who they are and what they want next. But so we're seeing some sort of rebirth of the nation. We are also seeing a lot of solidarity and horizontal ties, as I said before, because we're seeing the falling off state institutions, and people are replacing these state institutions with their own help, self-help, and this is also how they are learning that they're together and that they're a nation.
It's interesting to, when you say that, it makes me think that maybe this is much closer to a kind of French or American civic identity based on an idea, rather than what you see in neighboring countries where identity is based on history, geography, language, and sort of ethnic roots. And perhaps in a way, Belarus is potentially a far more modern country than some of its neighbors.
Yes, yeah, well, that's absolutely possible. I wrote a short article where I was actually discussing the formation of civic identity of Belarus, because the national identity has always been weak. Belarus has always been a part of another state, either it was a Lithuanian principality or later the Polish kingdom or then the Russian Empire. And people used to call themselves Tuteishi, meaning from this land, because they don't really associate themselves with the national, with the ethnic or national group. And now today we're again seeing people of different ethnicity participating in this protest, and they are not really focusing on national myth or national history or on any other aspects of ethnic nationalism. It's really about their dignity. Therefore, it's called the revolution of dignity, as Belarusians like to call it themselves, because it's their identity as a civic nation. It's about their rights, their civic and human rights.
Which, of course, revolution of dignity is also a term we heard in Ukraine as well. But Mathieu, I want to get back to what does the outside world do about this? Because we've kind of established that the Belarusians don't actually know what they want yet. They know what they don't want. That the West isn't quite sure how much it cares and isn't quite sure what it should do. The Kremlin is playing for time. It's a kind of three-way vacuum in which if someone did decide what they wanted, that presumably would mean that things might move quite quickly. And we know that just as nature abhors a vacuum in physics, usually political vacuums get filled from somewhere. So what do you think is going to happen next?
So one of the ways for the West to engage, if we look at it from a long-term perspective, would be to, in a way, make sure that Belarus, that the current opposition has its homework done and comes with a list of potential demands in a way of how best we could support. It doesn't have to be a very united logic. It doesn't have to be on the EU front, for instance, or on a sort of Western alliance to help Belarus, but it could be very coordinated and targeted actions from international civil society, for instance, or international donors, or with the assistance of human rights advocacy groups or human rights NGOs, for instance, that could actually facilitate the work of potential transition, to expose and shed more light on the very evil measures that the Belarus government is using at the moment against its own population, and not least because of the death of people now on the streets of Minsk. And beyond. So this would be, in a way, a good attempt at creating this concerted international effort. Once again, not necessarily a state-based logic or an EU-based or global West logic, but very much so at the level of where we are now in Belarus, which is a very bottom-up, civil society-led grassroots movement that wants dignity, as Katia was mentioning. And the best actors for this would be global civil society, for instance, or international donors. On the other hand, we also need to recognize that we need to put more pressure on the Lukashenko regime without putting too much pressure that would actually benefit Russia if Lukashenko comes running into Putin's, in a way, arms, because we would have put too much pressure on the government. But we also need to recognize that economically, there's a lot that can be done in terms of targeted sanctions, for instance, where it actually hurts, not for the citizens of Belarus, but for the regime, for the people who are known advocates and known parties of the current regime.
It's interesting, the reflex in the West, whenever we're faced with an abusive, brutal regime is to say, let's put sanctions on. And
Yeah.
indeed, it's, can work very well. But I worry that looking back over the last 20 years, we've had many rounds of sanctions against Belarus, both political sanctions, expelling them from the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, and different economic sanctions, sometimes American ones, sometimes EU ones. And I wonder in retrospect whether that was all a bit of a mistake, that what we should have been doing is hugging Belarus close and speeding up its economic integration into the sort of global and Western economy, which would have then diminished the dependency on Russia, decreased that sort of fatalistic mentality which you find in some places, encouraged more Belarusians to go abroad and see how the rest of the world works. And we might have undermined the Lukashenko regime more effectively that way, rather than through these what seemed like the obvious policy tool at the time. So I wonder, do you think we've, looking back on the history of sanctions, what's the lesson? What should we have done differently, and what should we do now?
It's a very good question. I couldn't agree more, in a way that sanctions policy is just one tool out of many, but it's ultimately seen as the sort of the only stick that we have in a playbook that actually works, because they're easy to put together, and they can sort of target people and generally achieve some effect and some level of effect. So in the in this hypocrisy of box ticking exercise that we need to do something, then sanctions are the very easy box to be ticked, because they do achieve effects that we can calculate and measure in a way. But also the only problem is that they do target citizens, and they do have negative consequences on the very lives of actual citizens and not just the regime. Because these regimes, whether it is Belarus or whether it is Russia at the moment, for instance, with international sanctions, are really good at deflecting the consequences of said sanctions. And let's not forget that we are not talking about a consolidated political elite. We are talking about just a handful of cronies sharing power and not redistributing any form of wealth, to the rest of the population. So this is very easy for these people to, in a way, deterritorialize their own financial assets and their own authority out of the country and lead it from abroad, in a way, almost, when it comes to foreign assets, or when it comes to their own financial assets. So sanctions are a thing, yes, but they should also lead to constructive engagement, but also conditionality, that our interest comes with a price. The West moving closer to Belarus, or bringing Belarus closer to Western interests, for instance, as it were, if we were to discuss closer integration with Eastern Partnership, for instance, and maybe in the future, when the regime has changed and some things have moved in a positive way in Minsk, then maybe more European interaction and maybe some more NATO interaction. But this is probably a step too far at the moment, that we will not discuss, of course. But it also comes with conditionality that goes way beyond any form of conditions that the Eastern Partnership defined. We can't just throw money out of the window and not ask for anything in return, which was a tendency of the European Union in the 2000s that I think we've learned the hard way. And we've learned that constructive engagement and targeted constructive engagement is better than just throwing some money out of the window with very little effect and result.
The standout exception to this, I think, very well justified criticism of Western sort of ignorance, overreaction, and neglect towards Belarus is, of course, Lithuania. And I want to finish up, because, well, amazingly, our time has run out far faster than I thought. I want to come back to you, Katia, and say, can you explain a bit, why is it that the Lithuanians seem to have been the spearhead of the, perhaps not just the spearhead, the almost very little real support, a little bit from Latvia, surprisingly little from Poland. But what's been the impact of Lithuanian engagement in Belarus, and what's the roots of it, and how would you interpret it?
Well, obviously, Lithuania is Belarus' neighbor. It's only 170 kilometers from Minsk to Vilnius. So it's very easy to get them. Lithuania has been now for years, during Lukashenko's rule, been very helpful towards hosting Belarusian opposition towards hosting Belarusian civil society. When Lukashenko started cracking down on the opposition, and particularly in 2006, for example, when many NGOs had to close down, many newspapers were pushed out, the opposition people were also put in prison. Lithuania was there to open the doors. For example, Lithuania hosted the European Humanities University, which is an independent artis liberalis institute that was set up in Belarus, and now it's functioning in Lithuania. Many, as I said, political parties were forced, civil society members were forced to have their meetings in Lithuania, because in Belarus they could not secure a venue. They could not even go to the forest, to the woods, because they would be targeted by the special police. And obviously, Lithuania is very concerned now about the power plants, nuclear power plants that Belarus has just started, has launched its operation, and then it had to stop it. And now it seems like it's coming into operation again. Not all the tests have met the international and the EU standards. Lithuania, having closed its own Ignalina nuclear power station, is obviously very concerned, particularly because the power plant is just based on the Lithuanian border, about 30 kilometers away from it. And having the regime of Lukashenko, a repressive, unstable, unpredictable regime who now has the possession of nuclear power, is obviously very, very scary thing. So therefore, Lithuania has been very helpful, and it admitted and let Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the Belarusian opposition, stay in Vilnius when she was harassed by the Belarusian KGB and Siloviki, and had to flee the country. And many other members of the opposition are now doing their activity from Belarus. So I think that from Lithuania, sorry. So that's why I think Lithuania is very engaged. Obviously, it wants to have a stable, predictable, and democratic neighbor.
So our final few minutes, I want to go to Mathieu. You've written this fascinating report for CEPA on Russia's assets and liabilities in Belarus. What do you think specifically we should be looking for in the coming weeks and months as Russia builds up its influence? Do you think we'll be seeing them inviting rivals to Lukashenko to Moscow, building up individuals in the regime? Do you think it'll be more of a sort of economic push? But if you had your kind of checklist of things to look at for the coming weeks and months with regard to Russia's influence, what would be on it?
Thank you very much, Edward. It's a good question. I think I would look in the shadows, in the sense that whatever Russia is plotting, whatever the Kremlin is doing, or might be doing in the weeks and has been doing for the past few weeks, is mostly in a sort of very unofficial politics and unofficial outreach to Belarus and whatever may come out of this sort of stalemate between the opposition and the government. For one, in terms of political influence, I think Russia needs time to rebuild its networks. They need to reach out once again to all these operatives and all these potential networks of influence that they used to have, that they were banking on in the past few years, but that Lukashenko has also been systematically limiting or even destroying when it comes to the links with the secret services or the intelligence services, for instance, where links have been a bit disbanded over the past few years. So Russia is using the chaos at the moment in the country, in Belarus, to try to bid for time and use its clout and leeway to rebuild these ties, so that whatever comes out next, whatever happens to Belarus, they will be ready to reactivate these cells. Economically, and also in terms of security dividends, I would look really closely at how Russia might influence the future of what could be argued as the crown jewels of Belarus, the state-owned companies such as Belaruskali, for instance, the potash fertilizer producer, or even the crown jewels of the military-industrial complex of Belarus, like the Minsk automobile plant or the Minsk tractor wheel plant, that Russia is not even hiding its intention to acquire some shares if these assets were to become privatized. So in a way, I would look at the sort of network reconfiguration around these things to see if Russia is interested is interested, sorry, in acquiring more shares in there if these companies are privatized, but also in terms of security dividends that Russia could extort from Belarus, not least discussions around permanent basing, for instance, for Russian troops in Belarus, which has always been a very strong point of discord between Putin and Lukashenko very personally, and that Russia might be able to extend its leeway in terms of strengthening air defense capabilities, for instance, or integrating further certain segments of the Belarus military industry. So look for the shadows and leave no stones unturned, I would say.
Right. And a final word to you, Katia. You've written an awful lot for CEPA about Belarus in your capacity as a non-resident fellow with our Russia program. But cast your eyes very sharply on the opposition. Is there a particular individual in the opposition who you think might be taking on a leadership role, or a particular tactic that they could be adopting that might work? Can you see any way out of the stalemate that they seem to be in at the moment, of turning up, getting beaten up, going home, and then turning up again this next week for a kind of rinse and repeat?
I think, well, as I mentioned, that all the opposition, the current opposition, they're very new, they're all new faces, and they are romantic to some extent. They think that the popular movements will topple the regime, which is really naive and unlikely to happen in Belarus. What I think they have to do is to, well, as I said, to build a long-term strategy, thinking maybe years ahead. They have to use the tools which are available, the legal ways which are available. If Lukashenko is discussing a draft new constitution, we understand the Eurasia dialogue, but the opposition maybe it has to come up with its own draft and propose it to the public, so that it can at least build some discussion around it and try to push it through parliament or put it on the referendum. And I think it would be very important for the opposition to try also to find some links to the nomenclature in Belarus, to the public officials. We have seen some defections from diplomats, for example, and some of them were quite well based and worked in the presidential administration. I think the opposition movement probably has to lose its naivety and romanticism and think about, in very cynical terms, try to engage the expertise of these former officials to see who they can talk to and how they can persuade the officials to defect, because I think that would be crucial to win this revolution. We need some defections from the elite. Obviously, top elite is probably unlikely, but people around them, the opposition needs to find a way to build links with them.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that. I completely agree, and I apologise to any of the people watching this if they're expecting a vigorous argument, because I fear that all three of us basically agree on most things. And I think it's certainly true. Regimes tend to split at the top and crumble at the bottom, and those are the two places for the opposition to look at. But that's it from CEPA, from our discussion on Belarus. I just want to remind you that we've been joined by Mathieu Boulègue, who is at Chatham House here in London, but is a friend of CEPA and has contributed a piece to CEPA on the Russia's assets and liabilities in Belarus, and also Katia Glod, herself from Belarus, but now living in London, who is a non-resident fellow with the CEPA Russia program, and you can see her many contributions to CEPA also on our website. And I'm Edward Lucas, another CEPA non-resident fellow, and so from a wet and windy London, I wish you many more interesting moments looking at this sadly neglected country, both in terms of attention and of strategic input, and we will be back on the subject again very soon. Thank you.